So welcome to session 2 of Doxacon. Hope everybody had a good break, got a chance to go outside into the sunshine today. And now we're getting into our session. We've got 2 speakers today. We're going to start with Cindy Collins-Smith. Her talk is called Barefaced and Brightfaced, Pestilence and Theophany Until We Have Faces. Cindy Collins-Smith is an assistant professor of English at Nova Annandale. She's contributed numerous essays to books on film, traced the development of Jack the Ripper mythos in print and screen media, dabbles in a little Harry Potter analysis, served on a variety of panels at film conventions and on podcasts. Her work on Ripper mythos has appeared in Ripperologist magazine and currently resides at Casebook, Jack the Ripper. Cindy lives in Falls Church, Virginia with her husband, Brian, and their cats, Severus and Minerva. She enjoys researching family history and exploring Byzantine chant. So you can go ahead and get started. If anyone's got any questions, you can put them into the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end of the session.
Hi, I'm Cindy Collins-Smith, and we'll be discussing how 2020 level catastrophes lead to theophany, that is, a revelation of the God, and ultimate redemption until we have faces. I think to a large extent, this talk was inspired by how the leadership in my parish guided us through lockdown, reminding us of the potential for spiritual growth, even during a time that we could not gather together. One thing I hope our discussion will do is prompt each of us to reflect on our own response to the pandemic and other difficulties in light of how the novel's characters deal with the catastrophes in their lives. And I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to get this up here. Just a second. Okay, share screen. And here we go. Okay. C.S. Lewis is, of course, an explicitly Christian author, but Till We Have Faces is one of Lewis's least overtly Christian works. It's set in a pre-Christian pagan world amid fear-driven primitive religion and a more skeptical and symbolic Greek religion. The theophany of my title is not a revelation directly of Christ, but of the god of the mountain, presumably Cupid, though more likely Eros, who is functioning in the novel as a representation of divine love, in essence, a prefiguring of Christ. Even in this pagan context, though, I find Till We Have Faces to be Lewis's most fully realized, mature, and profoundly Christian work of fiction. It's also his most novelistic novel. Although Lewis does toy with allegory, using characters aligned with beauty and ugliness to represent conditions of both soul and body, our narrator is more fundamentally a 3-dimensional character of psychological and spiritual complexity, capable not only of self-delusion, but also of re-evaluation and change. She's not simply an allegorical type, but speaks with a realistic narrative voice. And through Orwell's narration, Lewis shows that the worst thing we have ever done, and Orwell does commit a great sin, he shows that this worst thing can be the catalyst for beginning our spiritual transformation even decades before our full repentance. Because of the guilt she carries, Orwell, warrior queen of Glome, tries to distract herself from what she believes to be her doom by becoming a great ruler. She claims to have been so wounded that all her life had been but a hiding and stanching of the wound. To stanch the wound, she seeks wisdom, transforms her decrepit little barbarian kingdom into a prosperous one, and brings Greek learning to her land. And she does all this to distract herself from her inner life and give herself something to do, because her physical ugliness limits her marriage prospects, and her sin against Psyche and the god of the mountain has led her to believe that the god has pronounced her doom. In reality, though, what the god pronounced was a prophecy of hope and redemption, which she completely misreads because she cannot imagine a God of love, The quote on our screen, by the way, is the final verdict of her own people. That she was the most wise, just, valiant, fortunate, and merciful of all the princes known in our parts of the world. So with that little preface out of the way, let's look at the context for Psyche's sacrifice and Orwell's sin. Okay, this image is admittedly not from Mad Max, not from Till We Have Faces, but from George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road, a film that I think contains one of the best presentations of the wasteland in recent years. Here in this dry and barren land, water is scarce, while the ruler and his warriors rot from disease. These are classic wasteland tropes. Similarly, in Till We Have Faces, we find 2 consecutive years of bad harvests, followed by pestilence, drought, famine, the likelihood of war with a nearby kingdom, and lions coming down from the mountains. About all the kingdom of Gloam lacks is murder hornets. The conclusion? That it's all tied somehow to the king's barrenness of sons. "Where are your sons, king?" says one of the people battering down his walls. "Where's the prince? The king of Fars has 13 sons. Barren king makes barren land." Like most scholars of his time, Lewis was familiar with Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough and incorporated some of its wasteland and sacrificial elements into his novel. One key way pagan religions addressed the wasteland's barrenness was through human sacrifice, often the sacrifice of the king, like Christopher Lee's Lord Summerisle there, whose fruitfulness was integrally linked to the fruitfulness of the land. Hence the questions about the king of Gloam's barrenness of sons. Sometimes, though, someone else was chosen for the sacrifice, a criminal, a virgin, a person labeled accursed or blessed or turned into a proxy for the sacrificial king, or even chosen by lots. And by the way, that is not Christopher Lee's Lord Summerisle burning inside that wicker man. It's a proxy, involuntarily chosen for the sacrifice. And this substitution is, of course, what happens in Till We Have Faces, when Orwell's beloved sister Psyche is chosen by lot to be sacrificed to the shadow brute, who may or may not be the god of the mountain and who is thought to devour the sacrifice offered up as his bride. So until we have faces, pestilence and other wasteland elements lead to the need for a sacrifice. Sacrifice, in turn, leads to theophany, and this is where our characters' paths diverge. Up to this point in their lives, they have been inseparable, but they become separated both spiritually and physically when their encounters with the god lead to drastically different responses. Let's start with Psyche. In the god's late in life second appearance to Orwell, who is trying at that point to drown herself, he tells her, "Die before you die. There is no chance after." It's a lesson Orwell still needs to learn, but her sister Psyche learned 40 years earlier. On the night before the sacrifice, Psyche accepts her cross, what she believes to be her impending death. In a sort of crucifixion of her own desires, she reconciles herself to the sacrifice, even asking her sister, "Are these things so evil as they seemed? If the gods had chosen any other in the land, that would have been only terror and cruel misery. But they chose me, and I am the one who has been made ready for it ever since I was a little child. The sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, to find the place where all the beauty came from." Psyche has been called all her life to the mountain and to the beauty flowing from it. She recognizes that this sacrifice is her opportunity to reach the place of her calling, but she also accepts that sacrifice is a type of death. "How can I be the ransom for all Gloam unless I die?" she asks. "And if I am to go to the god, of course it must be through death." While Orwell counters with claims about the vileness of the gods, Psyche holds out hope that maybe the real gods don't really do these things, or even, mightn't it be, she wonders, they do these things and the things are not what they seem to be? How if I am indeed to wed a god? And that is the reality. She does become the bride of the god, not his food, just as we become the bride if we die to ourselves and join ourselves to Christ. But equally significant, the god becomes the bridegroom of a mortal soul. Because she has yearned for the mountain more than for her own life, Psyche, like the wise virgins in Jesus's parable, has been found watching. She is spiritually prepared when she is to be wedded to divine love instead of devoured by the shadow brute. Yet there is irony in the lamp image we see in this slide. In the parable, the wise virgins keep their lamps lit. Until we have faces, Psyche has been forbidden to bring a lit lamp into the bridal chamber. Before she disobeys the god's prohibition in order to save her sister's life, Orwell has horribly wounded herself in order to coerce Psyche into leaving the god. Psyche has lived in intimate communion with the god of the mountain, and her face is bright, as if glowing with the light of Mount Tabor. As it says in the quote on the screen, she was bright-faced. When she does prepare to disobey, Psyche's experience of divine love gives her confidence that the god will know she was coerced and ultimately will forgive her. And as Orwell's visions late in life reveal, Psyche uses her subsequent exile as an opportunity to serve as a sort of mediator and work towards the redemption of her sister. Ironically, the visible manifestation of the god occurs after Psyche's disobedience and appears to both sisters separately, pronouncing the judgment that Orwell misreads. Unlike Psyche, Orwell resists and then rejects the overtures of divine love. She wants to keep her life exactly as it was before the pestilence and sacrifice, with Psyche as her pet. In a letter to a reader in March 1963, Lewis writes of Orwell that divine love gradually conquers first a pagan and almost savage soul's misconception of the divine as Unget, then shallow enlightenment, the fox, and most of all, her jealousy of the real God, whom she hates till near the end because she wants Psyche to be entirely hers. On the one hand, Orwell's beloved Greek tutor, the fox, has taught her that the gods are the lies of poets, making her skeptical of anything that transcends rational understanding. On the other hand, she has been conditioned from childhood to fear bloodthirsty and devouring gods, Unget and the shadow brute, just as some of us may have been taught at some point to believe in a vengeful, hateful god. When the priest of Unget, Glom's goddess, brings a demand for sacrifice, he describes the pestilence and barrenness as Unget's anger, which must be satisfied. Though, as Lewis indicates, this conception is a misconception, it is one that Orwell has absorbed. She tells us in the quote on the screen that even as a child, she regarded the gods as terrible. Whether they were hideous as Unget or beautiful as Aphrodite made no difference. Immediately before the sacrifice, she thinks of Unget's music as holy, deadly, dark, detestable, maddening noises. And even after finding Psyche alive and essentially bathed in holy light, she tells her sister that as mortals, they rightly have nothing to do with gods and wonders and all these cruel, dark things. Despite the evidence of her senses, she can only think of the god as one of the cruel, dark things inhabiting what she calls a terrible place. The first time Orwell directly encounters the god, he pronounces the judgment on our screen, and I can only see part of it, but the upshot is that Psyche will go out in exile. The god cannot fight for her, and that Orwell will know herself. And the final part is, you also shall be Psyche. As she descends the mountain after that encounter, she believes that she will be thrown from her horse and die, thus fulfilling the judgment. But she arrives home without incident. Neither is she exiled from Glom after her father, the king, dies, nor does she fall in a one-on-one fight to the death with a nearby prince. Because she detests the gods, she believes they detest her too, and so she can only interpret the gods' words as bringing her catastrophe. Instead, the gods let her be to live her life. Immediately after the gods' judgment, Orwell permanently veils herself, not only hiding her appearance from the world, but hiding her inner life from herself. On the outside, Orwell is an enlightened ruler. On the inside, she has a never-ending litany of anger and hate consuming her, which even she seems unaware of until she determines to write her complaint against the gods, the book we have been reading, to set the record straight after hearing her sister's tale told some 40 years later in a manner that sounds an awful lot like our own Cupid and Psyche myth, complete with wicked sisters who seek to destroy Psyche out of jealousy. Orwell thinks it's slander. Despite having seen Psyche Brightfaced, despite having seen the gods' magnificent palace in a flash, Orwell is determined to believe that the gods had set for her an unanswerable riddle and then arbitrarily condemned her for making a bad guess. In reality, she was given opportunities to get it right. In fact, on the road to the final confrontation with her sister, Orwell has flung at her, as she puts it, the suggestion that her heart should dance. It's her hostility that causes her to view this as a temptation rather than a true invitation to delight. She sees it as merely preparation for some new agony. To Orwell, we are the bubbles of the gods. They blow us big before they prick us. She would rather believe Psyche mad or in the clutches of a robber than acknowledge the obvious, that Psyche has been wedded to a loving God who welcomes Orwell to a feast that she rejects. At the end of her life, in the last of a series of visions that have forced her to confront unpleasant truths about herself, Orwell is brought to meet with the shades of her dead and read her complaint against the gods. Uncovered, naked, no longer able to hide from herself, Orwell does not read the book she thought she wrote. She reads instead the vile scribble of the book she has inscribed in her heart, and finally hears the true voice that has consumed her these many years. And I can only see this partially, but the first line is, "We'd rather you drank their blood than stole their hearts. We'd rather they were ours and dead than yours and immortal." At the beginning of the complaint, Orwell says she could have endured it if the gods were things like Ungit and the Shadow Brute. She claims that she never really began to hate them until Psyche began talking of her palace and her lover and her husband. Not surprisingly, Orwell's complaint devolves ultimately into an angry toddler scream that Psyche was mine, mine. Orwell's visions have led her to recognize a connection between herself and Ungit. And this Ungit voice, or as the fox calls it, the demon within, has been playing on a loop inside Orwell these last 40 years. Ironically, at the moment she recognizes her allegorical Ungit self, she begins to break free of being Ungit. I don't know about you, but I recognize the Ungit voice from my own inner life. It's not identical to Orwell's, but if I'm not watchful, my Ungit voice can play motifs from my own anger and resentment and spite over and over and over in my heart and mind. It's something that I too frequently need help shutting down through prayer and confession. For Orwell, finally speaking her complaint is a form of confession. Uncovered and unveiled, Orwell finally acknowledges what she did know, what she lied to herself about, and what has truly been in her heart all these years. She is finally barefaced, unencumbered by the past, and brought to the palace of the god, where she is able to meet her divinized sister, who has labored, as Psyche does in the myth, to bring the cask of beauty, beauty of soul, to Ungit, her sister. In meeting Psyche, Orwell acknowledges her sin and turns from it, basically falling down before Psyche, kissing her feet, saying, "I will no longer call you mine. All that I have shall be yours. I never thought of you, I only thought of myself. I was a craver. Instead, Psyche tells her to stand, that she must stand because she has gone a long journey to bring the beauty, the cask of beauty, to make Ungit beautiful. Psyche offers her sister the fruit of her labor. And with the cask of beauty, we now see two Psyches, both beautiful, beyond all imagining, yet not exactly the same. And with that, the god pronounces his final judgment. You also are Psyche. It was never a condemnation. It was a prophecy. Orwell, too, has grown beautiful in soul and body, redeemed. And in some of Orwell's last words, I know now, Lord, why you utter no answer. You are yourself the answer. Before your face, questions die away. Thank you. And I have some reflection questions that I will put into the chat in Discord. Thanks.
We've got some virtual applause going into the chat. That's awesome. First, you certainly deserve it. We'll have to envision the raucous applause of an audience hall. That was a great talk. I'm not really familiar with that book, so those reflection questions that you have, hold on to them because we're going to need them at the end.
Okay, great.
Tanya just said wonderful presentation, so great job, Cindy. Okay. So our next presenter is Rachel Grabowski, Ray. Ray is a professor of medieval studies and English and is completing a dissertation on Eucharistic ecclesiology in early medieval England. She's taught in university settings at Cornell, Catholic University in Georgetown, in New York State correctional facilities, in adult and teen RCIA programs, and for one chaotic year, second grade religious education. She tries to meld her love of medieval literature and theology, medievalisms, fantasy, and comic books in each of her classes. Her hobbies include painting, knitting, quilting, making jam, and gardening, which hopefully has prepared her to be an accomplished lady in a Jane Austen novel, or able to survive after the apocalypse. Ray's talk is called The Banality of Goodness, Problems with Portraying Heaven in Film and the Possibility of Reading Road Warriors as Saints.
Thank you. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen and play a pre-recording of this because I have multiple clips in it. And the going between PowerPoint and that just added too much time and opportunities for issues. Also, just a quick warning, if you are listening around people without headphones, one of the clips contains a little language. So the talk ended up being PG-13. Thank you for what I'm sure was a very kind introduction. I've pre-recorded this talk because I doubt I would make it through without either technical difficulties or barking dogs, or probably both. Also, my discussion of Good Omens, The Good Place, and Mad Max Fury Road will be spoiler-filled. If you haven't seen them, I am sorry. But also, what have you been doing? Now that the caveats and warnings are out of the way, I want to dive right into our first topic, the depiction of heaven and angels in Good Omens, an Amazon miniseries released May 31st, 2019, and The Good Place, a TV show whose 4 seasons aired starting September 2016 and concluding in January of this year. To contextualize these, however, I want to provide a description of unspoiled goodness from someone whose praise we can trust. Satan. In Book 4 of Paradise Lost, when he first enters paradise, Milton tells us, abashed the devil stood, and felt how awful goodness is, and saw thereto in her shape how lovely saw and pined his loss, but chiefly to find here observed his lustre visibly impaired, yet seemed undaunted. Writing in the early 17th century, Milton is using the older meaning of awful, that is, something which inspires awe. So, after he has fallen, he looks upon the things of God and is struck with wonder at their beauty and goodness, and then, being Satan, this further fuels his rebellion. Good Omens is the story of an angel and demon who, in the time since creation, have become friends with each other and fond of Earth, so team up with some humans in the Antichrist to stop the apocalypse. In it, the majority of the angels, except really for Aziraphale, our main angel character, have all the signifiers of power and wealth. Yet, throughout the series, they are revealed to be cruel, ruthless bullies who only care about winning the war and who dismiss humans as simple and easily fooled. This is seen most clearly in one of the final scenes containing leaders of the heavenly hosts, including the archangels Michael and Gabriel. Even though the end of the world was averted, the archangels are concerned with getting revenge on Aziraphale for thwarting their chance to prove they are better.
Ah, Aziraphale. I'm so glad you could join us. You could have just sent a message. I mean, a kidnapping, broad day. Call it what it was, an extraordinary rendition. Now, have we heard from our new associate?
He's on his way.
He's on his way. I think you're gonna like this. I really do. And I bet you didn't see this one coming. So, with one act of treason, averted the war. Well, I think great good. Talk to me about the greater good, Sunshine, of the Archangel fucking Gabriel. Greater good was we were finally going to settle things with the opposition once and for all. I suppose I can persuade you to reconsider. We're meant to be the good guys, for heaven's sake. Well, for heaven's sake, we are meant to make examples out of traitors. So, into the fight.
They are clearly preferable to demons who are covered in bugs and toads and sores and scales and filth, and who do the traditional type of temptation and torture. So there's a clear contrast between the two, just not one where the angels seem good. In their large chrome sterile penthouse and tailored suits, the angels exude power in a very Nietzschean sense. As the Metatron says, the point is not to avoid the war, the point is to win it. And the ruthlessness of the hosts of heaven is made all the more terrible, in the original sense of causing terror, by their self-righteousness. The Good Place is a network sitcom that, over the 4 seasons, tells the story of 4 very different, recently deceased humans who try to navigate and then fix the afterlife. In it, we meet the Bad Place architects, aka demons, well before the Good Place architects. They are unappealing in a distinct way from those in Good Omens. We see them both as flaming monsters who talk about torturing humans with penis flatteners, bees with teeth, and butthole spiders, as well as demons who look like humans and act like the worst examples of reality TV stars or trust fund kids, throwing a house-wrecking party where they get wasted and do karaoke to fascist political speeches. We do not meet the Good Place architects, the angel equivalents of the show, until the end of season 3. And, at first glance, they seem like a comforting opposite when compared both to Bad Place architects and the angels in Good Omens. Here is their first appearance.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael. Thank you for coming. No, thank you for asking us to come. It is one of the great honors of my eternal life to be invited here today for this momentous occasion. Now, who are you and why are we here?
When, however, they decide what to do with the information a few minutes later, we see that their kindness is revealed to be impotent sentimentality.
In light of this new information, the time has come to take decisive action.
Wow.
can't tell you how happy I am to hear you say that.
We are going to form an elite investigative team to get to the bottom of this. And we are fast-tracking the process. It will take no more than 400 years.
Sorry?
It's aggressive, but you heard right. We are only giving ourselves 400 years to select the members of this elite team.
Wait, 400 years just to form the team? I was thinking that we could do something now-ish, like right now.
Michael, we have rules, procedures. We're the good guys. We can't just do stuff.
They are a cutting parody of woke, well-meaning, well-off neoliberals with the jargon and performativity of the worst of anti-bias and diversity inclusions. People who can virtue signal in all the right ways, but do not want to dig in and do the hard work of making things better. While in Good Omens, we are left to extrapolate what heaven might look like for those who are saved from the angels' treatment of Aziraphale, one of their own. When the characters of The Good Place finally reach the good place in season 4, the architect's niceness proves to have resulted in an utterly banal heaven. Unchecked wish fulfillment is not perfect beatitude. It is boring, soul-numbing, and creates zombies with its happiness.
Jason, your lifelong dream got old that quick. Monkeys, go-karts was fun for a while, and I was thinking, oh, that would be cool. Hippos and go-karts. I was like, what about Draculas with jetpacks? I did like 50 combos, and I just kind of wanted to hang up with you guys.
Okay, that's it in a nutshell. If you get here and you realize that anything's possible and you do everything, and then you're done. But you still have infinity left. This place kills fun and passion and excitement and love until all you have left are milkshakes.
The common ground between the depictions of heaven in these two shows is that they are awful, but in the modern sense this time, of bad, not pleasant, possibly even horrible, a far cry from the paradise that invoked awe in the devil in Milton's poem. So how did we end up where this is the depiction that two popular shows of the last few years gives us? It may be a problem of the medium. Indeed, the Angels of Good Omens and The Good Place can be seen as a logical extension of Hollywood trends in film. Film is a very definite medium, with casting, setting, lighting, costume design, dialogue, and the other elements that make up movies and television shows. All aspects of the heavenly hosts are defined when they appear on screen, and a loose canon of visual language and tropes has coalesced to depict divine beings. God or angels are pretty people, usually dressed in light colors, maybe with some lighting effects making them stand out or seem supernatural, but with the quirks and foibles of humanity itself. This is a sampling of depictions I was able to assemble without much effort, and I think a convincing argument could be made that they are precursors to the heaven of Good Omens and The Good Place. Placed on screen, with dialogue and elements of backstory, they all seem so human. After that, it is an easy stretch to creating a heaven populated by creatures with human sins and failings, but amped up with supernatural powers. One possible corrective for creating better heavenly hosts would be to take a lesson for both the tradition of apophatic or negative theology and the horror movie principle to casting monsters, hint but don't show. Any depiction of God in art necessarily falls short, since it is an attempt to use human language and human senses to describe an infinite being. As apophatic theology reminds us, Christians can say with much greater certitude what God is not than what he is. So hinting at the grandeur of God and letting the audience fill in the details helps protect him and the heavenly hosts from being made in our image. The problem, however, is that then stories like Good Omens and The Good Place wouldn't work. Beyond just trying to thread the needle concerning how the divine is depicted in art, there is another problem with the depiction of heaven in these shows. The Christian definition of heaven as the ultimate end and fulfillment of the deepest human longings, the state of supreme, definite happiness, is almost inconceivable to the modern person, especially the modern American. The definitive happiness is contemplation, not the fulfillment of the ego. It is the kind of love that involves giving of oneself to others, not the glorification of the self. The visions of heaven presented in Good Omens and The Good Place are the logical outcome of a world where, in the cultural imagination, God is dead. And in his place is not the cold rationalism of a purely materialist world, but, as Josef Cardinal Ratzinger has pointed out, the old gods under new names. Modern society has returned to the core forces behind the polytheistic pantheons of antiquity: power, bread, and love. In doing so, they make absolutes out of what is not itself the absolute, and they thereby make slaves of men. The world has not been disenchanted. Rather, in the place of God, impersonal forces have been deified to better fit our post-religious age. And the heavens of Good Omens and The Good Place are made in the image of these gods. The angels in the case of the former are avatars of force that do not care about the individual, and the Good Place architects of a love that makes no demands and requires no sacrifice and cannot work towards the good. So the problem with these depictions of heaven, from a Christian point of view, is not just that it's a topic not well suited to the medium, but that they are trying to fit Christian elements into a post-Christian worldview, and it is the Christianity that comes out skewed. As an antidote to a post-Christian view of the world, Christians thinking about art have highlighted a shock, something that causes mundane things to be seen anew and as they really are. In her nonfiction writing about the craft of storytelling, Flannery O'Connor talks about how, in a world that has lost a sense of sin, redemption is meaningless. The challenge is to find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to Christians, and to make them appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. When you have to assume that your audience does not share your beliefs, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. In addition to the grotesque as the vehicle of shock, which is O'Connor's tool of choice, Pope Benedict XVI highlights the ability of a moment of pure beauty to make a person see anew. It draws him out of himself, wrenches him away from resignation and from being content with the humdrum. It even makes him suffer, piercing him like a dart. But in so doing, it reawakens him, opening afresh the eyes of his heart and mind, giving him wings, carrying him aloft. Between these two, we have a rough formula for how to make movies that communicate a Christian worldview and sense of good and evil. Luckily, the world building in fantasy and sci-fi stories make these a great vehicle for the juxtaposition of the grotesque and the good. I am, however, going to skip over what might seem like the obvious examples, the ones that feature a lone, usually male, messianic figure who alone can save everyone. Instead, I argue that one of the best examples of this is a film that is missing these obvious Christian allusions and tropes, and, in fact, never mentions a recognized religion, which is 2 hours of kinetic action, groundbreaking stunts, all the more impressive since they are done almost entirely without CGI, and what some critics have called the best car chase in film history, Mad Max Fury Road. I could honestly talk for hours about all of the ways this film is amazing. However, for the remainder of my time, I'm going to focus on just a couple of issues: the movie's central theme, the portrayal of solidarity in it, and the main character's self-sacrificial acts to show the ecclesiological vision at the heart of Mad Max Fury Road. For those unfamiliar with the movie, it is the story of Furiosa, who, together with the 5 wives, women kept as sex slaves by the warlord of their post-apocalyptic society, steal an 18-wheel war rig and escape from a Morton Joe, said insane warlord, who rules the Citadel through his control of the water it contains and the devotion of his army of war boys. Their goal is the Green Place, a distant utopia peopled by the many mothers And they are initially hindered and then helped by Max, a loner who has been captured by Immortan Joe's forces, and Nux, a war boy. When they get there, they find out that the Green Place has died and is now just wasteland like everywhere else. On Max's urging, they turn around and take the Citadel, toppling Immortan Joe and his patriarchal, oppressive regime. The primary message of the movie is stated quite clearly, literally scrawled across the walls of their former rooms by the wives. We are not things. The women are not sex objects or breeders to create a new generation of warlords. The war boys are not cannon fodder to be sacrificed for Immortan Joe's ambitions. Max is not a blood bag, fuel to keep a war boy going. People are not things. Through the wives' message, the agency afforded to each character by the plot, and the refusal of the cinematography to objectify characters, the film acknowledges the personhood and dignity of each character. The second radical thing the film does is disguised by the simplicity of the plot. The fact that it is a car chase in one direction, and then back to where they had started from. The chance for peace and redemption comes through acts of solidarity, and it requires Max and Furiosa both to stop working for their own individual goals. Her, chasing an empty dream of a far-off utopia, and him running from his demons alone.
All right. This is your way home.
We go back.
Back?
Yeah.
I thought you weren't insane anymore.
What are they saying?
He wants to go back from where they came.
Citadel. What's there to find at the Citadel?
Green.
And what?
There's a ridiculous amount of clear water. And a lot of crops.
It's got everything you need, as long as you're not afraid of heights.
We just know where it comes from. Pumps it up from deep in the earth. Calls it aquacola and claims it all for himself.
Because he owns it, he owns all of us.
I don't like it already. It'll take 2 weeks to skirt the wall of mountains.
No. I suggest we go back the same way we came. Through the canyon.
It's open than that, right? We brought all his war parties through it.
So we take the war rig and we charge it right through the middle of it. We can decouple the tank with the boss. Shut it up behind us.
Cabo. And how exactly do we take the Citadel? Assuming we're still alive by then. If we can block the pass, it'll be easy. All that's left are war cups. The war boy's too sick to fight. And we'll be with Nux. He's a war boy. He'll be bringing us home, bringing back what's stolen as he's meant to.
Yeah. Feels like hope.
Like this plan, we can start again. Just like the old days.
Look, it'll be a hard day, but I guarantee you that 160 days right that way. There's nothing but sweet. At least that way, we might be able to. Together. Come across some kind of redemption.
They realized that, quite literally, they had everything they needed where they left. The Citadel is the Green Place. And in making the choice to return, they confront and overthrow the dehumanizing power and realize that their freedom only comes when it brings everyone else along with them. This decision leads to the final point I'm going to make today. Max, the titular brooding male action figure, is only able to act heroically when working as a team or helping the women directly. When he is acting for his own selfish ends or trying to flee the company of others, his actions are ineffective and result in his being captured, beaten, or just shown up by Furiosa and the wives. The culmination of his heroism, however, is not a typical daring stunt or even the self-sacrificial move to kill the bad guy. Towards the end of the film, when Furiosa collapses due to blood loss from a wound sustained earlier, Max takes the line still attached to him from his earlier use as a war boy's blood bag and gives his blood to save Furiosa. He reverses the common action movie tropes around the hero and blood, that it is either something they shed to look tough and cool, or something they cause others to shed, showing their power and their opponent's weakness. Max instead uses it to give life to a friend. Mad Max Fury Road takes the post-apocalyptic genre's promise of a utopic future and makes attaining it tied to the specifics of the film's present. In contrast to the solipsistic individualism of Good Omens and The Good Place, where freedom is equated to the attainment of one's desires, Mad Max's vision of goodness and salvation is ecclesiological. It can only be achieved in communion with the rest of society. So while there is no depiction of heaven within the movie, nor even of the hoped-for better future, the movie ends with Furiosa, the wives, and their companions having just taken the Citadel. The understanding of those characters as a community whose freedom and redemption are tied together is the idea of the Christian community bound together as the body of Christ, translated into, albeit simplistic, secular terms. Max and Furiosa both provide a model of Christian action, where the goodness of what they are doing is embodied in the community around them, and especially set against the cruelty of the barren desert and Immortan Joe's dehumanizing oppression, provides the shocking vision spoken of by O'Connor and Pope Benedict. They inspire awe. The heroes of Mad Max are models of a community bound together by self-sacrificial love and together striving for goodness. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. That was a great talk. You'll have to envision the applause again one more time. Good call on having it be a pre-recording, because those video clips I think did add a lot to what you were trying to pull together. So we've got some audience questions. Question from Daniel, and do you think I know how to say that word? So for Rachel, Ray, can you give some examples of media approaching portrayal of God in an apophatic way?
Yeah, so this is actually something I cut from the talk. I was trying to think through, like, to be fair, really like both Good Omens and The Good Place and don't want media like that to go away. So like how a Christian may think about ways to depict God and the divine on film. And as for apophatic ways, this is what I came up with. Painting by Henry Oswald Tanner of the Annunciation, and actually the burning bush in Prince of Egypt, both of which use light to portray God or angels, which I think is good, but really both focus your attention on the reaction of the person to that. So your response is really guided by their timidity, their awe, their wonder. The other would be to use like the more biblical stranger visions of God and angels from Revelation that medieval art did. Was quite happy to include places, but that runs the risk of getting campy very quickly. So yeah, just initial thoughts.
Okay, very cool. Thank you for that. I've got a couple more questions. This next one's for Cindy. How are we to understand the darkness and horror of Ungit and the Shadow Brute in contrast to the beauty and goodness of the God of the Mountain? Is the darkness and horror merely a distorted picture that has come down to the people of Gloam? Cindy, around? that one was more focused on her.
There we go. That's a great question, and it's one that I've been trying to work through myself. Lewis, does make that comment about it being a misconception of the divine, that Ungit is a misconception. But at the same time, I think there's a tradition, and I'm not a theologian, but I think there is a tradition historically that of the gods, the pagan gods being demons. And the fox identifies Ungit as the demon within. They're very late. Actually, it's in a vision after, at the very end of Orwell's life, where, Ungit is identified as this demon within. And she's been recognizing that she has a lot of attributes of Orwell, that she is, in a way, Ungit herself. But I think that this darkness is also something Lewis was familiar with the work of Gilbert Murray, who wrote on the 5 stages of Greek religion. He had actually attended lectures at Oxford of Murray's and had read the book and was corresponding with Murray shortly after he wrote Till We Have Faces. And Murray's thesis is essentially an atheistic thesis about the different stages of Greek religion. And we're very much it's not a Greek society, it's a barbarian society, but we're very much in a chthonic gods period here, where the people's idea of the gods is extremely basic and focused on horror and crop preservation and survival, sort of like, it's like that whole Fisher King motif. Whereas in later times, it's on the cusp of moving towards the more idealized Greek gods that the fox brings, like Aphrodite. He doesn't really believe in the gods, but he knows the younger priest of Glom and the younger priest of Ungit. And kind of by the end of the novel, that last quote, or that actually first quote, I think, where Priest Arnom gives his assessment of who Orwell was, he identifies himself as the priest of Aphrodite, not the priest of Ungit. So there is kind of an evolution of concepts of the gods also. So I think we're dealing partly with this whole very primitive religion in a transitional period. And the god of the mountain is the counterbalance to all that, the true God, really the prefiguring of the true God, who is nothing like those chthonic gods that are imagined by the people as they try to grapple with the horrors of the world. Life is hard in primitive societies. And so the gods are pretty hard too. So I think there's a lot of all of that going on there. There's kind of a mix of things. I hope that makes some sense.
It went over my head, but I'm sure it was very edifying for everybody else. Thank you for that. That was great. I very much appreciate that. Okay, so got another question. This one's directed for Ray. It seems like the philosophy of goodness in contemporary media is often reduced to what we would call lawful good kindness. Given your medieval background, are there older Christian stories about goodness that show lawbreaking or unkindness? And do you think there are good ways to portray those aspects of the good other than how Mad Max does it? And they qualify that with brilliantly.
Yeah. And I would also push back against the contemporary media just being lawful good kindness. I'm thinking of something like Firefly, where wow, all I can think of is Max because of the talk, but Mal, the ship's captain, very much isn't an anti-hero, presents himself in that way, but he goes out of his way to help people stand up against kind of oppressive powers. And he is a very sort of, I would say more on the chaotic, lawful, chaotic good part of the spectrum. But thinking of older medieval things, there definitely are. And for the most explicitly Christian ones, I would actually look at the mystery cycle plays, which were biblical retellings that were staged in medieval towns in the 14th and 15th century. And they went through the town on the Feast of Corpus Christi and basically did staged retellings of all the major biblical stories. So you got all salvation history going through a town, but the way that they like characterize Noah or the shepherds from the birth of Jesus very much make them grumpy, recalcitrant, very like human, but still part of salvation narrative. It's a fun way of approaching that and definitely gets out of the lawful good matrix.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So another question, a Christian reading of Mad Max is very powerful and edifying, but do you think that the lack of explicit connections to Christianity or religion weakens the ability of such stories to soften people's hearts towards religion or Christianity?
Yeah, and Cindy, feel free to jump in here because I feel like the same thing is true Until We Have Faces, because it's, as you said, one of Lewis's works where there is an explicit Christianity. It is a pagan Greek story, at least on the surface. So I think that in a way that almost makes it more powerful, that ups the shock value, the like shock and ability to communicate that. And I'm thinking kind of explicitly here of something like The Lord of the Rings, which is an older, in Christian circles at least, very well-known story, and one where once you start talking about the morality in it, a lot of non-Christians will just like, yeah, but Tolkien was a Catholic. Yeah, but obviously there's a religion thing. There's something in it that makes it a little bit dismissible. Whereas Mad Max, just having those themes set in such a sort of like stark, harsh world, and it coming through a secular media, like it really gets at the idea of sort of like natural law and natural goodness. Even if you're not Christian, if you're showing trying to show a really good world, Christian elements will come through because all truth and goodness points to the truth and the good. So I think like it makes it a little more like covert portrayals, and once you see it, like makes them more powerful.
Okay. Cindy, did you want to add anything to that? We've got a few more questions. We're at 3:00 now. We've got a few more questions if we'd like to answer those before we move into our breakout groups.
Should I add something to that or listen to another question? Because I'd love to add something there.
Yeah, you got it.
I think that Till We Have Faces for me is very, very powerful, and part of it is because it's not in the foreground. You know, it's kind of backgrounded. It's now for me as an Eastern Christian, it just kind of fits into my own perceptions of faith. So the novel really strikes me as being very, very profoundly Christian. But a lot of people are very confused by the novel and have a hard time figuring it out and figuring out how did Lewis as a Christian, write this and what's it mean and all of this stuff. So it is difficult for people to kind of, figure out what Lewis is doing there. And they know that it's supposed to be Christian because it's Lewis, and they can't quite figure it out. And I think part of it is because it's set in this pagan world. So it makes it complicated. It makes it difficult for some people to find the faith elements in it. And then for other people like me, the fact that it's not put so much in the foreground makes it all the more powerful. So I think it becomes kind of a subjective thing there. Not that the message is subjective, but the response to some extent is subjective, that we respond to it differently, but some of us are going to find it powerful and other people are going to be confused.
Okay. One of our questions, or in the chat earlier, somebody said that Till We Have Faces didn't quite hit them, but maybe this talk will kind of bring it into a new light. So we've got a few more minutes and a few more questions. So regarding the Good Place's depiction of heaven, does the solution that they end up implementing in the show go deeper into the problems with the initial depiction of heaven, or does it bring the show in a different direction?
Yeah, so in case anyone hasn't watched it, I am going to spoil it for the context of answering this question. I'm very
sorry. It's been 10 months. I think you're okay.
I know, but I do feel bad a little bit. So the solution they come up with to fix the like infinite happiness in a like anything I want, I can instantly do or get, is they give people the option for annihilation at the end once they've had enough of that type of heaven with their family, friends who start to be able to enter because they have reformed the bad place into a kind of purgatory, making people better so they can get to heaven. Once you have had enough of that sort of bliss, then you can cease to exist. And I think that that really gets at, like, it shows the depth of the problem in the Good Place's depiction of heaven, because honestly, if that is your idea of eternal happiness, then their solution makes sense. But it really shows the kind of facile nature of that understanding of heaven and happiness, that it is getting whatever you want, just like endless fun. So I think it does, to answer the question, really just underscore the initial issues.
Okay. People say that about life, like it's valuable because, you know, you have a limited amount of time, you gotta like get stuff done. Like that's why people like vampires who live forever, they get bored eventually. Yeah. So it's very kind of similar in that way.
Yeah, and like with the apophatic theology, like if we had to spend all of eternity like just contemplating a created thing, yeah, we would get bored. But God being infinite, like we can't comprehend like the newness and an infinity of contemplating him will not exhaust us like discovering and having new things revealed and it being anew. It really is a sort of like limit of us trying to think about this from our limited human bodies and perspectives and experience.
Okay, great. So we've got one last question and then we're going to wrap it up. You also related negative theology to the horror concept of hint, don't show. Do you think that's one reason why horror as a genre often discusses spirituality beyond the gothic trappings of devils and demons, etc.? She specifically asked, fascinated by how cosmic horror like Lovecraft could be utilized to explore this concept of the ineffable.
Yeah, that's a really
good Omens fun.
That's a really good question. Something I hadn't thought about. Off the top of my head, I would say that it seems to me, so like there are a lot of film genres where there's a threat of bodily harm to people, like most action films, war films, like that type of thing is something you see a lot. So to amp up the kind of stakes and peril for the people, giving some sort of like cosmic stakes, so it's imperiling both their soul and their body, I think is a big reason behind some of it. Like, if you want to show why, like, a Lovecraftian type monster or something like Dracula is so much worse than, like, I don't know, a like earthquake or a sniper, you have to add that spiritual dimension to it. But I really like the sort of like thinking through the implications of the apophatic component to horror and monster films. I don't know who asked that, but I think they should come up with a Doxacon talk for next year about it. Horror actually is not my genre, so I don't read or watch a lot of it, so I'm not the person to give that talk.
Okay. All right. So you're on it, you guys. Call for papers next year. You got to be ready. All right. So that was the last of our questions. We're a few minutes into our breakout discussion time, so we'll wrap it up here, and then everyone can break out into their discussions to talk about We Have Face It, Till We Have Faces, and Mad Max, and everybody else. Okay.